And they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "Y'all, my soul is very sorrowful. My soul is sorrowful even unto death. Would you remain here and watch?" Going a little further, he fell on the ground and prayed. He prayed the prayer that we've all prayed. If it were possible that the hour might pass from him. And he said things that we have said many times. "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Because all things are possible for you, would you remove this cup from me? Yet not what I will, but what you will." And he came and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. For the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping? Are you taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And immediately while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, with a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. And now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard." And when he came, he went up to him and at once and said, "Rabbi," and he kissed them. And they laid their hands on Jesus and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but let the scriptures be fulfilled." And they all left him and fled. The word of the Lord is blessed. You may be seated. I want to title our sermon from this passage this morning, "We are weak, but he is strong." Would you indulge me and just turn to your neighbor and tell your neighbor, say, "We are weak, but he is strong." I thought that somebody would praise him right there. What we see in these verses are incomprehensible. They are literally incomprehensible. Jesus, who has declared that he is going to be the Messiah, that he is the Son of God, that he is God. He finds himself in his darkest hour. It's incomprehensible. And like I told you last week, what we see in the scenes leading up to the cross they're They're scenes that if people were trying to invent a religion, they would not have come up with. It doesn't make sense. It's incomprehensible that a man who is supposed to be God finds himself asking that he would be spared from death that he knew he was supposed to die. And that his disciples would be falling asleep on him in his greatest time of need. It's incomprehensible. But it should let us know that this scene actually did happen. And if it truly happened, since it happened, if you're here this morning and you have not believed in Jesus, I want to invite you to believe in him. He didn't go through this for nothing. It's incomprehensible that a man who says he is God would willingly subject himself to this type of agony and would willingly subject himself to the difficulties that lie at hand. And this morning, I really want to be really simple and to the point. Because I think what we are to see from this text is how unique Jesus is. He is a man that was just like us. He was fully human, and he agonized because he knew that something was coming ahead that was going to be extremely difficult for him. And if any of us were in the same predicament as he was, we would think we would be justified to accommodate our flesh and to flee the scene and not take on death. In this garden, it is dark. He has not been arrested yet. Everybody that would have been able to see him leave is asleep. And yet, he does not flee the scene. He stays knowing that he's about to be arrested and taken off to be crucified. But he doesn't leave the scene. He would have been justified. All of us in this room, if we were in the same predicament, we'd be like, oh, they sleep? I can go now. Nobody would ever know where I went. It's interesting that Jesus deals with this before he is nailed to the cross. Where in essence, he doesn't have any choice because he's nailed to the cross. He's in the garden. It's dark. Nobody would have noticed where he went. And everybody was asleep. And he doesn't. And in this scene, we see Jesus in agony. Commentators talk about how the words that Mark uses here, they are words that describe that what Jesus was going through in the garden perhaps was more difficult than what he would go through on the cross. It says that he was greatly distressed and troubled. Y'all, those words don't really capture how he was feeling. He was feeling overwhelmed to the point where he felt he was about to die even though he wasn't on the cross. This is a grim moment. Have you ever been in a moment where you had no idea how you were going to trust God? The moment was so troubling. That it made you cry yourself to sleep. In the other accounts of this scene, it says Jesus was in such great agony that his body played a trick on him. And that when he was supposed to be sweating, his body played a trick and he was bleeding where he would have been sweating. In Jesus, we see his humanity. There's not many more things more human, more natural than to not want to die. And we see him praying a prayer that we all have prayed. We know that God has his will. We know that God has his way. But we also know at the same time that God can do the impossible. And he prays. And he says, all things are possible for you, God. All things are possible. Isn't that the conundrum that we find ourselves in so often? Where God's will is pit against our will. And we're trying to figure out, God, surely there must be another way. Surely this is not your will. Jesus is saying, God, if there is another way, God, there must be another way. God, you can just at the snap of your fingers will it to go a different way, and it could go a different way. But then he continues on his prayer in the same way that many of us continue on our prayer. He says, nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done. We see Jesus in total, utter agony in these scenes. He is agonizing over the fact that he is not only going to have to die, but he is going to have to take on God's anger and wrath. And it is an unbearable cup for him to drink. It is the wrath of God that is a cup that he's going to have to drink, and it is completely bitter. And he is agonizing in prayer with his Father. He is trying to subject his will to the will of the Father, agonizing in prayer. And I want to tell someone today, if you're in a Garden of Gethsemane moment, where it seems like God's will is incomprehensible for your life, that what he is doing doesn't make sense. If Jesus could go to God and agonize, you can too. Go to God in prayer. He knows what you're thinking already. He knows what you're feeling already. And don't be afraid to say, God, I know all things are possible for you. Don't be afraid to ask him to change it. Don't be afraid to agonize with God in prayer. And then after agonizing in prayer, if it wasn't bad enough that he saw the imminent danger that was lying ahead, he comes out of prayer and he sees those closest to him have fell asleep. It is so disheartening when you are going through a tough time in your life and you feel like you have no one that you can depend on. Jesus is trying to be strong, and he goes and sees his disciples succumbing to the weakness of their flesh. Listen, y'all, this is another one of those scenes where they're almost justified in the fact that they're sleeping. It's late at night. They just finished eating dinner. They had had a few glasses of wine. They were tired. Naturally, it makes sense. Naturally, it makes sense that in their flesh, they were weak. Their eyes were heavy. They needed some sleep. Jesus comes in 3 times, sees them asleep. And when he comes to them the first time, he says, could you not watch even for 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter temptation. For the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. We see the disciples in the weakness of their flesh, and the weakness of their flesh, they're succumbing to their physical nature, to their fickle nature that's sometimes hot, sometimes cold. But then after that, we see in the last portion of this text that Jesus concedes, and he allows himself to be betrayed and handed off into the hands of the men who will arrest him. And everything will get in motion. He'll be mocked. He'll be scourged. He'll get a crown of thorns placed on his head. He'll have to carry his cross all the way up Golgotha's hill. He'll be nailed to the cross. Everything is about to set in motion. And Jesus concedes. He doesn't flee. He concedes to the will of God. They think that they have seized him. They think that they have caught him. But no, Jesus is actually voluntarily giving over his life. He's like, yo, why y'all coming with clubs and all these weapons? Y'all know I'm not that type of dude. And sealed with the kiss of a betrayer, he basically says, go ahead and arrest me. The hour has come. It's time for all of this to be fulfilled. The reason why I came to earth, it's now time for all of this to be fulfilled. And Jesus demonstrates strength like none other. Because before he's nailed on the cross and he doesn't have a choice, in the garden when he has a choice and when he has a decision, he does what we can't do. He does what we all know we would have failed at. And he doesn't falter. And he does this, I believe, so that we can see how strong he really is. And that we can trust his strength. His strength is juxtaposed against the weakness of the disciples. And if there's anything that we need to acknowledge is that we too are weak like the disciples. We will accommodate for our flesh all the time. Even when we say we're going to be strong, we're not strong. We fall asleep because we succumb to this flesh. But Jesus was unique in that he did not succumb to the flesh. He did not make accommodations for the flesh when he could have, when he would have been justified to. He did not deserve to be arrested. He did not deserve to die. But in these moments, we see Jesus We see true strength in him. We see strength in him when his disciples were weak. When Judas was a coward. And when this band of army came to arrest him, thinking that they had some power, when Jesus could have called down a legion of angels to take care of them just like that. We see Jesus showing true courage by subjecting his will willingly to the will of the Father. And y'all, we need to see in Jesus a true Savior who is willing to subject his flesh and his will to the will of the Father so that he can be strength for us in our time of need. That when we feel we're in the Garden of Gethsemane and we're alone, that we can know we're not alone. Because Jesus felt true loneliness so that we would never have to feel it truly. That Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, he demonstrated true strength, true courage, so that when we would be at our weakest moment, we can trust in his strength and his courage. Y'all, when we are weak, he is strong. I just want to speak that word over someone today. In your flesh, you feel weak. You feel like the disciples. It is so heavy, you can't even keep your eyes open. You can't even describe the weight of it. And Jesus took the full weight of the cross to let you know that he's stronger than any situation that you will ever face. And even when you are weak, he is strong. When you find yourself in Garden of Gethsemane moments in your life, don't be afraid to agonize with the Father. Agonize. Pray to the Father. One of the reasons why Jesus was able to face what he was able to face, the difficulty that lied ahead, is because Jesus was found praying in his moment of weakness. Agonize with the Father. Pray. But also acknowledge your weakness. If you're ever going to draw strength from Jesus during your Garden of Gethsemane moment, you will have to admit that your flesh is weak. That you, in your flesh, you will always give into temptation if you don't trust on the strength of Jesus. Jesus told them, watch and pray that you may not enter temptation. Jesus had told them the few verses before, we looked at it last week, he told them, he said, listen, all y'all gonna fall away. And Peter says, no, not me. Even if they all do, God, Jesus, I'll die with you. He said, I would ride or die. And Jesus was like, nah, you gonna ride, but you ain't gonna die with me. Because Peter failed to acknowledge the frailty of his flesh, the weakness of his flesh. It is when we are weak that we find that God is strong. God gives grace to the humble, and he opposes the proud. You need to agonize with the Father in prayer. You need to acknowledge that you're weak. but you also need to concede to the will of God. Job said it this way: though he slay me, yet will I trust him. When you're in your Garden of Gethsemane moment, you need to concede to the will of God. Don't concede to your flesh. Don't accommodate your flesh. Don't give in to the weakness of your flesh. Concede to the will of God. Jesus said, let the scriptures be fulfilled. And he conceded to the will of God. I'm done. 1 Peter chapter 2 says this. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not threaten, but he continued entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds we have been healed. For we were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of our souls. We look to Jesus in our Garden of Gethsemane moments, because that's the only way that we find strength in those Garden of Gethsemane moments. You can't find strength in yourself. You can't do it. And that's why Jesus had to come. That's why he had to die. That's why he had to drink the cup of the wrath of God. That's why he had to be taken to the cross. That's why he had to be buried in the grave. Because on our own, we are weak. But we're never alone. If you see Jesus in your Garden of Gethsemane moment, you can know that you are never alone. The song says we come to the garden alone, but can I tell you, even when we come to the garden, we might be alone. We may not have any physical bodies near us, but Jesus is with us right there in the garden. He knows our every weakness. He knows our every trouble. He knows our every trial. He knows every weight. And in those moments when we are weak, we can be confident that he will be strong, because he demonstrated strength like none other in the Garden of Gethsemane. You are my strength.